Alrighty, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Subscribing to My Podcast. Because I have a new guest on the show every week, it's very difficult to get consistent viewership. So if there's one thing that you can do to support me and the guest featured on my show is by interacting with the video. You can always unsubscribe later if you hate me or the content. Without further ado, here's your episode with Stephen Biggs is a professor of philosophy, and he taught yours truly a couple semesters ago, but his interests are in cognitive philosophy, perception, and he has some interests in politics, psychology, and of the works. But he was a wonderful professor, and I decided to bring him on and converse with him about some of the writings that he's done and some of his opinions on some philosophical topics. But Steve, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell guests some of the important things that they should know about you?
As you said, I'm a professor of philosophy. I have 2 kids. I spend a lot of time with my 2 kids. I don't know what one should know about me, if anything, but I don't know, maybe the things that one should know will emerge as we talk. So
Yeah.
I'll just leave it
Well,
there.
you know, one of my first questions, I thought one of the coolest things to read is that you teach a parkour class for
Yes.
high schoolers. And I know that you board, and I've seen you bouldering and like rock
Yeah.
climbing at the gym.
Yeah.
So are your kids also interested in these things? If you kind of...
So to some extent, my daughter does a lot of moving, my son a bit less, but they both have done parkour a bit. In fact, I started the parkour class because Surefire Fitness in Ames had like young kid kind of parkourish classes. And then she aged out of that because they only went up to about 13. So I asked if I could start one for kids a bit older than that. And she does that, although she's off right now because she's doing improv, so meets the same night. My son does a little bit of parkour. My daughter climbed for a while, but she doesn't climb so much anymore. And she skateboarded for a little bit, but doesn't do that so much anymore.
Yeah.
She plays volleyball and does high jump, and they both do a lot of theater.
Okay, well, and that's really... Did you do theater, or is this...
Not at all. So
Okay.
I had no exposure to theater, but it's really cool. Through them, I've become exposed to doing theater. And my wife, who also had no exposure, has now built the sets for the last several shows through their children's theater company, Story Theater Company. And I've helped a little bit with that as well. So.
Well, yeah, I'd wondered if your wife was like the theater part and then you were the more like active part, and some of this is just completely out of the blue.
Yeah.
Well, and I'd also noticed that a lot of coaches come from parents who want to watch their kids do things or like hang out with their kids. So it's kind of par for the course that you needed to become a coach so that your kids could do more parkour. That doesn't shock me. And so now that your daughter's out of it, you still are teaching and still doing that stuff.
Yeah, and the class is awesome because it's comprised mostly of, not exclusively now, but initially it was just my daughter's friends. And they were mostly theater kids. And it's still comprised a majority of theater kids. So it's not like kids who are antecedently doing parkour. It's kids who got into it through, this accident.
Yeah, who are like, well, if I saw parkour club or parkour class, you best believe I would be there. That just sounds so interesting to me. You only see that stuff on like YouTube videos and like, I'm going to teach you how to do a backflip or something. And that's what you do, but you professionally, technically teach a class about parkour, which I find very interesting.
Yeah, it's super fun.
Yeah, well, in this journey of, how you become a teacher or a coach, I wonder where your philosophical journey and like how you got here to be teaching philosophy here and what that looks like. So where do you come from and how did this learning process go? And then how did your interest spark into you teaching philosophy and being here?
So my first exposure to philosophy was purely accidental. So I was not a very good student in high school. In fact, I was a very bad student in high school. And I went to college on an athletic scholarship and I wasn't especially excited to be there academically. And I chose classes not quite randomly, but pretty close to randomly. And I signed up for a class just because a friend of mine was in it, as people do. And it was called something like Minds and Brains. And it was co-taught by a philosopher and a psychologist. And at the time, these things wouldn't have meant anything to me, but the philosopher was a hardcore mind-body dualist. He was about as intense a mind-body dualist as you can become. And the psychologist was a hardcore eliminativist. He thought there's no mind at all. And they would bicker, and I don't even know if it was the philosophical content as much as it was just fascinating to watch the two of them bicker. And I was like, this is actually interesting. And I thought, okay, it's the psychology bit that interests me because the eliminativist sort of was more in my attitude. His views fit my attitudes at the time a little bit more. So I started to major in psych. And then I pretty quickly realized that the philosophy was more the part that I was interested in. So I added a philosophy major and did both. And that's how I sort of got exposed to the subject. And I'll move forward from there in a second, but backing up from there, I've realized over the years that my sort of philosophical education actually began much earlier because my dad is always making jokes that are language-based, based on sort of like ambiguities in language and infelicities in speech and ambiguities in grammar. And a lot of contemporary philosophy, especially analytic philosophy, tracking very carefully meaning and ambiguity and grammar is really important. So I think when I got sort of my first introduction to philosophy, I was ready to go in a way that many people aren't because I had this sort of informal, accidental training.
This training, yeah. You've been training your whole life.
Yeah. So that's how I chose my majors. And then after undergrad, I worked for a little bit and doing roofing and was ambivalent about it. I actually liked roofing, but I didn't want to be doing it 40 hours a week, and I certainly didn't see myself doing it 50 years out. And typically the path for people who, you don't see too many old roofers, and typically the path is to try and become a contractor of some sort, and I didn't really want to do that. So I decided to go to grad school, and I got a master's in humanities because my undergrad grades weren't bad. I guess by some people's standards, they'd be good, but getting into philosophy grad school is really hard. So they weren't quite there. And my general preparation wasn't quite there. So I got a master's in humanities with a focus on history and did pretty well there and enjoyed that. And then got a master's in philosophy and a grad certificate in cognitive science, and then went and got a doctorate in philosophy and did a postdoc in philosophy. So,
well, it's so interesting to me because not a lot of people have this drive to keep learning or this drive to keep pursuing the things that they're interested in. It's even past high school, they're like, I'm done, I'm just going to work. Or even past their bachelor level, they're like, okay, I'm just going to go into the workforce. It's definitely a different breed of person. And I think it's in the field of philosophy where you want to learn, like you just want to learn, like you want to keep learning. And I imagine you still actively learn now, or you still actively are. What do you think that does for you? Like, where does that come from, that kind of like urge to keep learning? Was there a moment where you're like, I want to keep learning for the rest of my life? Or is this something that you think about, or you think it's just internally that way?
That's an interesting question. I think most people are naturally curious about a variety of things. I think, sadly, schooling often kind of beats that out of you because we're not encouraged to pursue the things that happen to interest us. We're encouraged to, like at least when I was in, I didn't go to kindergarten, but first grade through senior year of high school, you're like told to learn some specific set of things and you don't really have the option of pursuing what interests you. And that to some extent persists through undergrad. And I really didn't really enjoy school until graduate school, where you're now like, whatever interests you, that's what you follow. So I think part of it is that we're all curious, and maybe I'm just more resilient to being, beaten down. Like curiosity managed to persist despite the efforts of our school system to squash it to some extent, which isn't to say that's uniform. Like, of course, there's lots of great teachers who encourage people to be curious, but I guess what I'm saying is there's a presupposition to your question, which is that most people don't have this kind of drive. And I think most people are curious. They just, for whatever reason, don't find the way that they can pursue it. And I lucked into finding the way that I can pursue my curiosity.
So then what would you categorize as your specific interests? Like, so when you were talking about you're able to study what you wanted to in your master's, what were those things that you were studying? And then how did that define what you are interested in?
So one thing that's really nice about philosophy is that you can study whatever you want. And this is one thing that differentiates philosophy from really in an important way from being a scientist or a psychologist. And I'm not saying psychologists aren't scientists, but that was the science that I was considering. And that's this. If I'm doing the philosophy of X, whatever it is, philosophy of mind, I can tomorrow be like, okay, I'm switching and I'm going to do philosophy of art. And I have to do some reading, I have to do some work, I have to learn some material, but that's on me and I can do it. Whereas if I'm running a lab, studying X, vision or something, I can't be like, tomorrow I'm going to switch and start studying personality because there's funding issues and there's all sorts of trouble with that. So one thing that's nice about philosophy is you can pursue whatever happens to interest you. And then I guess the other part of your question was like, how did I find my particular interest in philosophy? I don't know. I think a lot of it is just accident. So that first class that I mentioned was on mind and language, and that really hooked me, and I've been interested in that ever since. Although I've taken some detours, I did other kinds of philosophy at various points. I think some of it's just accidental. This is when I was exposed to the general way of doing things that is philosophy, that was the content.
Well, so would you identify like some of your specialized interests, at least right now, as like philosophy of the mind, philosophy of like perception, and stuff
okay.
like
I
this?
realized I didn't answer.
No, you're
question.
totally good.
Yeah. So, so I'm interested in philosophy of perception. I'm interested in philosophy of mind. I'm interested in philosophy of language. My main long-term research project involves elements of all of those, but it's you could think of it as the epistemology of philosophy. So how it is we come to acquire philosophical knowledge. And that's something that you might think wouldn't interest you if you're not doing philosophy, but the issues are actually pretty much the same issues that arise in science when you're choosing between competing theories that are empirically equivalent. So you have two competing theories that make the same predictions about experience. They both say the world's going to look the same way, but the theories aren't the same. How do you choose between them? That's a problem we face in philosophy all the time because philosophical theories, at least when they're good, are typically empirically equivalent. They make the same predictions about experience.
Well, when you're doing the roofing and you've taken this break in between your grad and your master's, were you still like reading up, like staying fairly knowledgeable, or were you just kind of like floating around for a minute?
I sort of intermediate position there. I wasn't pursuing anything academic in the way that one needs to in order to succeed in academia. But I was still doing some reading. During that time, I read David Chalmers' book, The Conscious Mind, which I ended up studying with him in graduate school, so that was pretty influential. So there were some things that happened in there in that downtime that were important for me, but I wasn't like, going through a book every 2 weeks.
Yeah, you were like studying.
No.
Yeah. And so you landed on this, you started reading. And so I guess to dive into your area of study, a lot of philosophy, at least to me, and this could be biased because I'm interested in philosophy, but a lot of philosophy seems really applicable to human nature in a way that not a lot of other areas of study are like that, in which like if you're studied in philosophy, that could improve your life in a pretty like direct way. Like I'm studying how to live life, how to do these things. And so there's kind of a purpose behind it. What would you say is like the purpose behind perception? Is it kind of that same thing, or like what do you find purpose in when you're studying philosophy?
Yeah, so that's a difficult question. So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking sort of how you can apply philosophical theorizing or what you learn from philosophy to ordinary life. Is that the idea?
Yeah, something like that.
So I think it's often quite challenging. There's two sort of prongs I'll give for an answer. One prong is the general way of thinking about the world that philosophy teaches is extremely useful for approaching any given topic and understanding the world. Bertrand Russell says that this is the point of philosophy. The point of philosophy is you sort of learn mental habits that will help you in other domains and in daily life in figuring out what's true and what's false, which is exceedingly useful if you want to get by in the world. The second prong is, I'll mention something about perception in particular. I think one key lesson you learn if you really study perception is that what we take to be given, what we take to be obvious, You're colorblind, so I don't know where along the spectrum you're blind, but probably you can see this as red.
Yeah. So
there's a bottle here. Are you red, green?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe not so much. Blue, are you blue-green as well?
It's I don't know. The whole colorblind thing is crazy because I'm like not color confident anymore. And so like I just
awesome.
interpret this as dark. Okay. I can see that it's blue if you told me it's blue, but like if you had me guess what that color is, okay. I'd be a little slow.
Good. I really like you saying you're not color confident. That's really, really awesome. But we should all be less color confident than we are. So this is the way I'll make the point. If you study perception, you learn just how much sort of guesswork your brain does to help you see colors correctly and shapes correctly and feel textures correctly and hear sounds correctly and so on. And because there's so much guesswork, there's all sorts of room for error. And as you learn more and more about how perception works, you'll become less confident in your perceptual judgments. Now, to be clear, our brain's awesome at this. So assuming you're not colorblind, you're mostly going to get it right. And you're mostly going to get shapes right and so on. But there's still always this guesswork and this room for error. And that should lead you to be a bit less confident in your perceptual judgments. And then here's the key move that I think is important. Once you recognize that you can't be sort of supremely confident in your perceptual judgments, you really should recognize that you should not be supremely confident in your judgments that require reasoning based on perception, or your moral judgments, or your political judgments, or whatever. And I think that's a really important lesson to learn, because as long as you're supremely confident, you're not going to be open to new evidence, you're not going to be open to alternative positions. But once you loosen up a bit and think like, okay, I could be wrong about this bottle being red or, it being spherical or whatever, maybe I can also be wrong about, which side of this conflict is the devil or whatever.
Yeah. Well, this is like my favorite topic of conversation. I think you've applied it really specifically into how your brain works and into this kind of scientific, empirical way of talking about it. I always talk about this in terms of like politics or like philosophies, but you've applied it into a way that I could like prove you this to be true by listening to like the fat bat experiment or like some of those other things that you put in your book. These are very like empirically researched. You suck at this, a kind of thing. What I found though is that in reading, I read most of especially like the chapters that you suggested that I should read, but I read most of the book. Perceiving is presuming, and you were very positive in the way that your brain works while also accepting some of the criticisms. Whereas normally when I approach talking about this, I'm pretty negative about how your brain works. And then, so it was kind of interesting, but I guess in terms of how you look at this in an applicable way, when you were writing this book, how did you come up with this, and how did you come up with like what this book means to you and like what the moral lesson of writing this book was?
So where it came from is my postdoc at University of Toronto. The first 3 years I was there, I was a postdoc for a philosopher named Mohan Mathan. And what I was doing basically was helping him put together events, a sort of lecture series, and also like workshops over weekends dealing with perception, where we'd invite in scientists and philosophers and have them give talks and hash out various issues. And going into that, I had not done what's called empirically informed philosophy of perception. So it's philosophy of perception that really focuses on the science. So prior to the postdoc, that wasn't something I'd done. So I spent a lot of the time as a postdoc there just trying to figure out what I thought about all this, what the important lessons were, why I would care about what I was learning about it. Of course, it's cool, right? The illusions are cool, but like, what's the upshot? Why should I care? And then the book is basically my attempt to come to terms myself with what it all meant, why it was important, but also, and maybe more importantly, make that accessible to a general audience. Because it was clear to me that this is like important stuff that people should know that they don't know, most people don't know, but not just the sort of like straight science, but also the sort of upshot, the lessons. and I was hoping to make that accessible to people. So,
Well, we were kind of talking out there, it definitely is like an easy read, especially compared to probably the empirical papers that write about those illusions and talk about the processes. And so I think there's a really cool conversation to be had about how this applies to what you were saying, other perceptions that you might feel confident about. And I think there's this really cool train of logic that you did at the end of it that was something along the lines of like, if you're supremely confident, then you are closed-minded. If you purposely lack this confidence, then you're open-minded. You should never be supremely confident about your perceptions, therefore you should always be open-minded. Or like something along those lines.
Yeah, I think that's basically right.
I thought that was a really cool way of like kind of tricking the audience into being like, okay, now you have to accept that you shouldn't really be as confident as you are about these things. And I think that that's such a difficult behavior to correct in people. And I guess in your journey of figuring this out for yourself, how has it affected you to kind of, although you're probably not perfect at subduing your confidence in certain things, how has that affected, I guess, your life? Like, how does it positively affect you to kind of be more aware about, your imperfections than most people?
I mean, mostly not in very deep ways, but in sort of simple ways, like, there's very common disputes among couples about whether I said X or I said Y, right? I think I said X, you heard Y, and I used to be like, look, I know I said X, and now I'm like, I don't know, maybe I said X, maybe I didn't, like when you say you said X and I say I heard Y, maybe I heard it, maybe I didn't. And you should have the same attitude, right? You should be like, so these kinds of things people should be a bit more relaxed about and less confident about.
A bit more just like agreeable in general, and you're not like so confident that your perceptions are the way that they are.
Yeah.
So when you're structuring this and you're finding some of these illusions, are there any of these particularly that you think just convey this point perfectly of your perceptions being?
I think there's illusions that are cooler than the one that I'll describe, but I think this one is the easiest to think about and to sort of get the point, and that's the hollow face illusion. So the hollow face illusion, you see a mask, and the mask is rotating around, and there's moments where it's entirely clear that you're looking at the front of the mask, so the nose is coming towards you, and then it spins around, and it's clear that you're looking at the back of the mask, but then it keeps rotating, and the back comes more fully into view, and it pops out, and it looks like you're looking at the front of the mask again. The nose is coming towards you, but you know it's the back of the mask. And I like this one because, one, lots of people are aware, okay, color illusions, you can see colors wrong, whatever. But shape illusions, it's a bit more powerful, right? You can see shapes very differently than they in fact are. And also because it's easy to see why. It's easy to see the role that your accidental experience plays in producing this illusion, right? So why is it that you see the back of the mask as the front? Because your brain has been trained that faces are convex, right? That noses come out towards you. How's it trained to see the world that way? Because you over and over see convex faces and very rarely, if ever, look at the back of masks, so you don't see concave faces. So it illustrates that how you see the world results from the training that you get. And most of us get the same training, right? And the training is good training, mostly. So we mostly see the world the same way and see it correctly. But sometimes the training is a little bit different, or your brain's using the clues a little bit off. So you'll see the world a bit differently. And the hollow face illusion actually illustrates this as well. And this is not a scientific finding. This is an informal finding that I get from presenting the illusion to students. What I've found is that if you ask people to name the moment that the mask flips, so it's rotating, the back is coming into view, and you're supposed to say, okay, here's the moment where it pops out. People will say it pops out at radically different times. Some people, it's not until it's sort of like full on facing them that they say, okay, now it's popped out. Some people, as soon as the back comes into view, they're like, okay, now it's popped out. And this persists even if you ask them to focus on a particular part of the face or whatever. And that suggests that they're seeing shapes differently in real life at various times. It doesn't come up, they don't notice, but yeah.
Wait, that gets crazy to think about too when you like extrapolate that into a bunch of other things that we might be perceiving. Like I know people talk about color as a big example of like, how do you know that your red is the same as my red and things like that. And there's science that we can point to, but very rarely with these illusions do you have something that you can actually like show somebody. And there are certain illusions. I don't know if you had this one, but I think you presented this in your class. But there's this one of it's a checkerboard, and then there's a block that is casting a shadow across the checkerboard, and then two colors look drastically different, but then you put them together in the same color because of like you're automatically assuming what the shadow color looks like.
Yeah.
And even when you're looking at it, like you know it's happening, you are completely aware that's happening. You look at it, it's still there. It feels like there's no like logic or reasoning that can undo this.
Yeah.
That can like unsee it. Like you just have to. It just has to be that way.
Yeah, and the only way to undo it is through kind of training. So if we give you training on a set of sort of images where the lighting is coming from below, or it's coming from all directions, or whatever. So shadow clues are no longer useful guides to what color something actually is. Do that enough, and I mean, I don't know that this has been done, but what would happen based on sort of the results from other experiments, what would happen is the effect would go away. Those things would look the same to you. But it's not going to be because you believe that they're the same, that they're going to look the same, or because you really think really hard. It's going to be because stimulus retrains your early visual processing system so that it no longer takes shading to be a clue.
Well, and that brings me to this next conversation that I wanted to have with you. There's a section in the book about your perceiving versus like reasoning, and like when do you start to employ logic into how you're perceiving things. In this section, you were kind of talking about both things, and you were using examples like induction and saying that like induction's circular, but it's still helpful. But I kind of wanted to just like grasp your general concept, like when you're fighting these bad perceptions or you're trying to overcome the likelihood of having a bad perception, where does reasoning come in to battle this? Yeah.
That's a difficult question, and I didn't really write directly about that question in the book, but I can tell you what I think. So there's a form of reasoning which I talk about in my work on the epistemology of philosophy called inference to the best explanation, also called abduction. And the way abduction works is basically you sort of look at all your evidence and you see what's the best explanation of this evidence, which explanation is best is determined by things like which is simplest. What simplicity amounts to is a very fraught question, but I'll just assume that we don't need to worry about that. So there's these various things that philosophers call theoretical virtues. They're like simplicity, unification, explanatory range, so how much you can explain. And the idea is the best explanation is the one that sort of scores the highest on the most virtues or something like that. And I think if you're deciding, if you're sitting, you're not just like looking harder to see if it's red, but you're sitting down and you're thinking, okay, here's all my evidence. And you're trying to decide what color is this thing. I think that's what you do. You do inference to the best explanation. So like in the checkerboard case that you mentioned, you might immediately say, without me even having to say anything, when I put it up on the screen in the context of showing you all sorts of other illusions, you might be like, those two grays are the same. They look different to me, but they're the same. Why do I think that? Well, he's been showing me all these illusions that work this way. And so I have that as a bit of evidence. And the best explanation in this context is he's doing the same thing again. So I think that's the kind of reasoning that you ultimately use when you're deciding. But of course, typically we don't do that because we typically don't really think about it. We just take our perception at face value.
Well, there's a huge convenience factor to just perceiving things and walking away. Most people don't have the RAS to like figure out how do I interpret everything that's happening to me at the same time and like see how it's affecting me. But
which makes sense.
Like, and you don't really blame them for it. But I guess in your pursuit, I'd figured, at least when I read this, I'm a very like implemental, like prescriptive person of like when I read something, it's like, how can I prescribe this to somebody else's life or my life? Like, how can I do this? My first thought was, how do I combat this? Like, how do I fix this? How do I help it? And I had kind of just wondered like where reasoning comes into that, or how you feel about that thought process.
I guess I think you don't need to worry too much about combating it on a sort of day-to-day basis, because by and large, you're getting it right. And by and large, when you get it wrong, things are quickly corrected. So suppose you see take the rotating mask again. You see the back, you're looking at the back of the mask and it looks convex to you, and that's where you start. Well, as soon as you sort of walk around it, you're gonna be like, oh, that was the back of the mask. It's concave. So it's pretty quickly going to be corrected. And usually perceptual errors will pretty quickly be corrected. And even if you can't pretty quickly correct it yourself, there's other people to help, right? So take a case like the dress. The dress is the famous illusion where some people see it as bluish and blackish, and some people see it as whitish and goldish. It's in fact bluish and blackish. If you see it as whitish and goldish, your perceptual system is doing something perfectly fine, and that's fine, but you are getting it wrong. You're getting the colors wrong. And people are going to tell you, right? There's going to be someone else who sees it as blue and black, and they're going to be like, I don't see it as blue and black. I mean, I do, but somebody who doesn't would be like, I don't see it as blue and black. What are we going to do? How are we going to hash this out? And you talk about it and figure it out.
That's such a funny diss. I'd imagine there's another person who studies like perception who's like, no, it's objectively golden, white, or whatever, and you just dissed them super hard.
Well, they wouldn't say that because the dress, there's a fact about the dress. It's a real world dress.
Right.
And that dress was bluish and black. So.
I know. It's just like with that level of confidence, it's so funny. If someone's like, no, it's not. It's not actually.
Yeah.
You just defended like half the population with like one statement. But
it doesn't look that way. It looks whitish and goldish to some people, and we know why. So.
Well, no, and I think that's really interesting. You would kind of spread this out though to applying to other facets of life, like politics or like morals and stuff, and that like maybe your first intuition isn't necessarily correct. Do you kind of study that in regards to some of these like attribution errors, or like, I know you did a lot of psychology and stuff too. So do you also study the errors that people make morally or psychologically as well? And do these kind of align with your perception errors too?
I mean, I don't do research on cognitive biases, but I teach about them, so I know about cognitive biases. And in many ways, cognitive biases, they don't all operate in the same way, but very loosely, they operate in the same way that perceptual biases do. You have some unconscious processing going on, and the unconscious processing is making use of clues that are imperfect guides to reality, but in general, good guides. So as soon as reality is a bit unusual, what's a good clue when reality is normal is not going to work anymore. It's going to lead you astray. And cognitive biases often operate in the very same way. There's various clues that your brain's making use of that in general are pretty good guides to reality, but things are a little unusual in some circumstance, so they're now bad guides. And so the general structure of perceptual biases and cognitive biases is the same. And the solution to addressing them is very loosely speaking the same, which is you do something like inference to the best explanation. You sit back and you think, okay, I'm going to go slow now. I'm going to see what the competing theories are. I'm going to look at all the evidence, and I'm going to see which theory best explains the evidence and go with that one.
Well, a lot of people, a question that I find myself asking a lot of people on this show is, are there people that disagree with you or that disagree with this general concept? And if there aren't, like scientifically, what do you think like the general public's reason for not maybe pursuing this to the fullest is? Like why aren't they reading up on perception? Why do they think that this isn't like useful or,
So there's a few different things. So one, there are, of course, sensible experts who would disagree with probably most of the things I'm saying. So I'm prescribing a way of thinking where you're always acknowledging all sorts of uncertainty. And there's people who think that that's deeply misguided because you should only act when you're certain. So uncertainty precludes action. There's also people who think it's deeply misguided because it's cognitively impossible. So why would that be? Well, suppose I really take uncertainty seriously. So I'm never willing to assign a probability of 0 to a hypothesis. So I always keep the threshold a little bit above 0. And I'm never willing to assign a probability of 100% to a hypothesis. I'm always keeping it a little bit lower. Well, then because I'm never willing to sort of rule anything out, I'm always dealing with an infinite range of hypotheses. And I can't reason over an infinite range of things, and neither can you. So it's just not the sort of view I'm prescribing is not something that our brains can do. I don't think that's right. But there's a reason why some experts would say, don't think about things that way. There's also the sort of solution to the problems that I'm prescribing, that when you need to be careful and you sit back, you do inference to the best explanation. There's plenty of people who disagree with that because there's plenty of people who think that that's not a good form of reasoning. So
what are their alternatives? Do you think? What are your like competing theories? Because I know you did conceiving versus abduction. in one of your papers. But.
Yeah. So conceiving is an alternative when it comes to what's called modal epistemology, or thinking about what's necessary and what's possible. I take it right now we're talking about something looser, which is like just figuring out ordinary facts.
Yeah.
And the standard alternative when thinking about ordinary facts is a particular kind of Bayesian reasoning, which I don't think is a bad kind of reasoning. It's just not where I think you should do at the end of the day if you're trying to be as careful as possible. But the Bayesian reasoning says this: you start out thinking whatever you think. And there's no really, there's different views of Bayesian reasoning, but the sort of what's called subjective Bayesian says there's no really way to assess whose starting points are better. And then once you sort of assign some probability to a theory, given your starting points, you see how strongly your theory predicts the evidence. And then you look at some alternative theory and assign a starting point to that and see how strongly it predicts the evidence. And then you do some calculations to figure out the probability you should assign to the theory given the evidence. I'm not articulating this in a way that would be helpful to people who don't already understand Bayesian reasoning.
Like, general. But I guess the main objection then, or like, it seems as if the difference, is it this starting point? Like, that's the big difference, because abduction seems to be kind of a step-by-step process. Like, does it fill these? So
one way to think about it is, abduction provides pretty strong constraints on your starting points. So if you have a theory that's really complex and I have a theory that's really simple, I say my starting point is better than yours. And if you're of this other ilk, you say simplicity. Why should we think simplicity is a guide to reality? Why should we think these theoretical virtues more generally are a guide to reality? There's nothing like that we can use. So how do we assign starting points for theories? There's just what you like and what I like.
Okay, I see.
There's not really an objective way to adjudicate any disputes like that.
Okay. Well, and I could see how people aren't comfortable with that. I know a lot of people who are comfortable with the idea of objective anything, of like anything is better. So I know some people who struggle just to say that anything is better than others. So I'd imagine, I guess, that like abduction makes people uncomfortable in that way, that they're like, I don't really like assessing objectivity, period. So yeah. I guess I could see that.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't have a problem with subjectivity. In fact, I think reasoning that's essentially subjective, like certain kinds of Bayesian reasoning, is perfectly good reasoning. It's just that it's not the only thing we can do.
Yeah. Well, and I guess how do you navigate between like the subjectivity? Because I remember reading a little bit about it in induction or. Inductive reasoning, I think. You were talking about subjectivity and how that it's like kind of circular because you can never, basically just that it was circular and that there's a level of subjectivity that you just have to be okay with, because if you say something's subjective, then it never actually finishes. So I guess like how do you navigate like subjectivity?
So there's a couple of separate things there. So one is there's this argument that induction is a bad form of reasoning because it's circular. And that comes from David Hume. It's an argument philosophers have thought a lot about. And the basic structure of the argument is this. If I'm going to generalize to some unobserved sample from what I've observed, I have to presuppose that the unobserved sample is relevantly similar to the observed sample. Otherwise, why would I generalize from the unobserved to the unobserved? But in order to defend induction, the view that you can do that, you have to say, well, here's why I think induction works, because in the past, when I've generalized from observed samples to unobserved, it's gone well. Well, why do I think it's going to go well this time just because it went well in the past? The answer I seem to have to give is that, well, in the past, when I've done it, it's worked.
It's worked, yeah.
And it's like, but why is it going to work this time?
Because it's worked in the past, yeah.
Right. And then the only answer to that question is, well, now is similar to the past, but why do I think that, right? That's what I'm supposed to be establishing. Mm-hmm. So the idea is inductive reasoning is sort of viciously circular. And the way that comes up in the book is I say, look, that's a challenging argument, and it's hard to know what to make of it. But here's something to notice. Perception presupposes that what you're observing now resembles what you've observed in the past. Why does it presuppose that? Because when your brain is assigning colors, for example, or shapes or whatever, it's using all these clues that it's learned from the past. So when it's deciding that the face is convex rather than concave, it's used the fact that most faces you've seen have been convex rather than concave. When it's deciding that under these lighting conditions, this stimulus to my eyes means the water bottle is red, it's using the fact that in the past, under similar lighting conditions, when similar stimulus hit my eyes, it turned out the water bottle was red. So perception also relies on induction. So if you're going to say induction isn't a good form of reasoning because it's viciously circular, you would have to say perception is not a good way to learn about the world because it's vicious. It involves the same sort of the past as a guide to the present kind of principle. And the reason that hits, you might say, so what? So let's just say perception's not good either. But the reason that hits home is that Hume himself, who came up with this argument against induction, said perception's really good.
So they can't, yeah.
So the idea is you can't have it both ways.
Yeah.
And more generally, it's not just about, trapping Hume. It's pretty, if your position on a form of reasoning, your rejection of a form of reasoning implies that perception is not a good way to learn about the world, that's pretty damning for your argument. Because perception clearly is a good way to learn about the world.
Well, yeah, because it's what we do and it's at least effective in surviving and describing things generally accurately. Yeah. Although, I don't know, I feel like you might be more charitable about perception than like I am instinctually.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I'm generally thinking about literal perception and I'm thinking maybe of interpretation of perceptions. So like what do we make of the things that we perceive? I think that's probably where I would say that we're more wrong in general than you might. So I don't think it's the actual perceptions generally that are incorrect, but.
Yeah, good. And drawing a line between perception and interpretation is hard, especially because your brain is contributing so much guesswork to generating whatever perception is. So I'm not suggesting that that's not hard, but I will say that in general, the brain processes that do perception are really good. And the brain processes that do interpretation of perception are far less good.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the craziest things is how efficient they are. Just like how quick it is that you're able to pull all of these, definitions of things just by seeing them and to assess a situation within milliseconds of seeing it. Yeah. I think even if it was a 50-50 coin flip, I'd probably still think that was impressive at the very least that we could do it as fast as we do. Yeah. And the fact that it's more accurate than that, I think is.
Yeah, depending on how you time things, something like 300 milliseconds from stimulus to experience, that's pretty fast.
That's there's maybe faster than we need. I'm not even sure.
There's a lot going on in that time frame. Well, if you want to catch a ball or something, you need it to be pretty fast.
Yeah, which is just, we're kind of overpowered in that way in our design. But in regards to interpretation, have you done a lot of looking into, or I guess what are your general thoughts on the way that we interpret things in regards to how we, from perception to interpretation? Because to me, it seems as if we do things incorrectly most of the time, or at least there's a lot of room for growth.
So I guess I'm not sure what you mean by we do things incorrectly most of the time. So if I perceive this table as being roughly flat, and then I judge that it's roughly flat, I take it that's the interpretation. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Aren't most judgments like that?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking more in the realm of moral judgments of I see a scene and then I interpret it this way, or how I interpret you based on how you sit, how you look, how you those things that are just seem to at the very least can be manufactured to be better, even if they're not bad. There's just a lot of room for improvement. To be unbiased in a lot of the ways that I perceive you or the image of you.
Okay, good. So here I'd draw a distinction between what you might call perception-based judgments, like the judgment that the desk is flat based on it looking flat to me, and non-perception-based judgments, like the judgment that it's immoral to torture a child or something. Like you see somebody being, or I guess a better way to put it is I see a child being tortured, and I judge that's immoral. The content of that judgment is not sort of falling out of the perception. And there's a lot being added there. Whereas the content of the judgment, this table is flat, is falling out of the perception of its flatness.
I see what you mean.
Yeah, and I think judgments that are not perception-based there's a lot more room for error. It's very difficult. I don't have a moral epistemology, so I don't have a view on how we should go about making moral judgments or adjudicating moral disputes. So that one's a bit tough.
Yeah.
The other example you gave of like interpreting someone based on how they sit and so on, that's more along the lines of mental state attribution or personality attribution or something. And I've never really thought about personality attribution, but I have thought about and written a bit about mental state attribution. And again, I think we mostly get it right. Like I think we're good at it. So like, here's the easiest way to attribute mental states. Like I ask you, are you thirsty? And you say yes. And I'm like, okay, people usually don't lie. So he's
probably thirsty.
He's probably thirsty.
Yeah.
And I think most mental state attribution happens either in that way or in some way where our observations are very likely to get it correct. So like, I see you go get a drink. I'm like, oh, he was thirsty. So I think we're mostly getting it right. The temptation to think that, and I'm not talking about the moral domain now, that's much trickier, but the temptation to think that we're sort of like misreading other people's cues all the time or whatever, there's this big gap between people, is based on a tendency to ignore the mundane. Most stuff is mundane. Like most perceptual judgments are mundane and we mostly get it right. And most judgments about other people's mental states, I think, are mundane and we're mostly getting it right. It's just when things are interesting, we're more often, I'm not saying we get it wrong more often than not, I'm just saying more often than in the ordinary cases, we get it wrong. And because we tend to only think about the interesting cases, we think, oh, we're not super reliable. But
yeah, the sample is probably not super accurate. And I'd imagine as it gets more important, when you get it wrong, it feels infinitely worse than the 1,000 things that you get right. And that probably makes sense too.
Yeah.
I think in terms of thinking about it the way I do, I'm always looking for ways to do better or like improve. And so maybe that kind of like focuses my attention to the negative, even if it's not necessarily prominent. It's just something that I'd like to take control of.
Yeah.
So maybe that's probably where I get that. That's probably where I get that interpretation. And I also think that exactly what you're talking about isn't necessarily what I'm thinking of, and that you're talking about more of like the physical process of like perceiving, which is something that I'm not necessarily like thinking of generally, and I've lumped them into the same category, although I don't think they are in the same category. So
what you're thinking of what then?
Like you were talking about more like those moral judgments, like more of those. Yeah, I think I associate those with perception in terms of like when you perceive something wrong, especially like in an illusion or something like that. So,
and there is, just to be clear, there is a school of thought that is on the side of sticking those together. I'm drawing a sharp distinction here, but there are people who think that we perceive moral properties. So they think that you literally see that it's wrong to torture that baby when you're watching the baby be tortured. There are people who think that. I'm just not one of them, so I'm not talking that way.
Yeah. Well, I guess in the realm of perceiving, it does seem like your literal perceptions of maybe this table or something like that, it does seem like sometimes those can influence. I know there's a lot of science behind color theory, and that like when you make a room red, guests are more likely to experience a certain kind of emotion because of things like that. Do you know kind of what I'm talking about, or that correlation?
I don't know that particular example, but there is a lot of science attempting to show that when you change some perceptible property in some way, it has some effect in a domain where you might not think it has an effect. This is going to be really boring, but one thing to be really careful of is distinguishing significance from magnitude when thinking about results from any science, but especially cognitive or social psychology. So you probably know this already, but I'll just say it anyway. To say that a result is significant is just to say it's probably repeatable. So if you did the experiment again, you'd get a result in the same direction. But that's not to say the effect is big. So if you have a decent sized sample and you get, say, a 1/4 inch difference in height between people with blonde hair and people with brown hair, that's going to be a significant result. But
it's not going to be an important...
But who cares? Because the magnitude of the effect is very small. And in these contexts, the reason I'm sort of cautioning to keep track of this distinction, my suspicion is if you find some emotional effect by making the room red, it's going to be one of these cases where the result is significant, but the magnitude is so small that if you attended to that, you probably wouldn't care so much about the result.
And it wouldn't even be worth the paint to achieve the result you're talking about.
Yeah, so there's lots of cases like this in the domain of food. So there's this cool cognitive psychologist, perceptual psychologist named Charles Spence, who does all these interesting experiments on food. And in a way, they're interesting because he gets all these significant results, but the magnitudes are typically very small. But the results are cool. So like if you eat an Italian meal off a checkered tablecloth, you'll like it better than if it's not off a checkered tablecloth. If you play sounds of the ocean in the background while people eat fish, they rate it as fresher. And at first you're like, wow, this is awesome. But then you look at the magnitudes of the effects, and they're often, not always, sometimes they are big, but often they're just so small. You're like,
it's not even worth doing.
You'll rate on a 10-point scale. Instead of saying it's like, freshness is 7, you'll say it's 7.01.
Yeah. It's like, well, I guess if it does something, I guess maybe in combination, all of these things will equate to slightly better. Well, because I think about this in sales, because my dad will talk to me a lot, and he does sales, and he'll talk about the details and like the ways of talking, or you'll talk about these aspects and you'll say that these things are proven to increase sales. And I feel like a lot of that has to be boiled down to some sort of perception of like the way you talk, the way you are. And I know that so much of your impression is formed within maybe the first 5 seconds of a person. Mm-hmm. And you assess them by, again, you were talking about those characteristics. Mm-hmm. What's the exact term you used? I think you wrote your other paper on it, but your moral attributions, is that what you said? Or
mental state attributions?
Mental state attributions, yeah. So those aspects, but I guess I just hear about it so often that I feel like it's important, but it might not be.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, but you just always want to be careful when people say, it's been proven that this, doing this has this effect. If it's a sort of effect from social or cognitive psychology, you want to be like, let's slow down and see how big this effect is.
Before you, right? Well, because you had said something in class. You gave an example of people who are more politically affiliated are less likely to see distinctions between shades of gray or something like that. And you said that was like just a kind of a BS study, or that it didn't, it wasn't significant in any way.
Yeah.
Or something along those lines.
So that was a non-significant result, but a super interesting non-significant result because it wasn't published because the authors had high integrity and were careful. So they had this massive sample, and they got this result that people who are sort of politically neutral can distinguish shades of gray better than people on the political extremes. That's super cool and interesting, right? The magnitude of the effect wasn't very big, and that's always like, be careful when magnitudes aren't big, but the result was significant, so you can publish it and everybody can, have you on their TV shows to talk about it. But the authors, to their credit, were like, this seems really weird. I wouldn't have predicted this, so let's try it again. So they tried it again and they got nothing.
Oh, okay.
Which suggests that it was a case where sometimes, even if your sample's big, it's going to fluctuate in ways that make something look like it's significant that isn't. Just like even if on average brown-haired and blonde-haired people have the same height, occasionally you're going to get a sample where the brown-haired people are taller on average.
Yeah,
and it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
So that was like that. And it had all sorts of interesting downstream consequences because the authors were like, wait a second, how often are experiments that look legitimate not legitimate? And turned out a lot.
And that stuff, because I'm psychology and philosophy, and I plan on doing research, and that class scared me in terms of like how much like bunk research there is out there. And you talked about like the replication crisis and all of these studies that were replicated and so little of them, and all of these errors that I need to be keeping track of, and I guess like what can you say to alleviate some of my tensions about research?
So this is not a super exciting thing to say, but I think it's the most useful thing to say. So one of the immediate effects of this particular shades of gray thing was Brian Nozick, who was the professor overseeing the grad students' research who had this finding and then redid it and didn't get anything, decided that he was going to replicate the 100 most popular cited social psychology experiments. And he, as you said, only about a third of them, a little less than a third, replicated. And that might make you really worried. But the interesting thing he also did was he had a bunch of psychologists bet on which ones would replicate and which ones wouldn't. And their judgments was really good. It wasn't
Okay.
perfect, but they really closely tracked what would replicate and what wouldn't. And what that suggests is if you just use common sense, maybe to some extent your expertise, your understanding of the domain, but let's just say common sense, to constrain your experimentation and what you make of your results, you'll get pretty far. So take the shades of gray one. They reacted exactly like they should. They were like, I wouldn't have predicted this. That's a really weird result.
Yeah.
We better double check ourselves. If you just do that, when you get a result, if it's something surprising and exciting, if you're like, hold on, the fact that it's surprising and exciting means it's not what I expected. And my expectations are based on how I think the world works. So I should take them pretty seriously. And you just sort of like back off and slow down and try things again. I think that would go a long way towards fixing your problems.
Yeah. I think people are pretty skeptical when it comes to research, and I think that gets me nervous sometimes and trusting authority or people who are doing research and stuff too. And so
and it's sad because there's a lot of really important and good research, and it's sad that people won't trust it when it's good. But it's also sad that we as consumers of research have to be so careful because sometimes the researchers themselves aren't. And also, even when they are, the system itself is constructed in a way that leads there to be a lot of false positives, a lot of published results that aren't legitimate.
Yeah, well, because one of your qualms about it was the p-value of less than 0.05. You say that that's not necessarily a good measure of quality of information.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky for a variety of reasons, but here's the basic overview. If you get a p-value of less than 0.05, let's just say you get a p-value of 4, that means that you would only expect the result that you got to be you'd only expect to get the result that you got for no good reason about 4% of the time. So you'd expect that like 96 out of 100 times, if you get this result, it's a legitimate result. And that seems like it's not very risky, right? It's still somewhat risky, but not super risky. But if you add in some institutional factors, it starts to look much worse. Like the fact that my paper is getting published. Like if I get P of 0.3, my paper doesn't get published. It goes away. So there's going to be this extreme selection bias where I'm just selecting from the P less than 0.05s. I'm ignoring all the other ones. But then it's like I'm sampling from this weird pool of results that appear significant and ignoring all the cases where they don't appear significant. And now the tables start to turn, and it's like I should expect quite often, not just 4% of the time, but maybe even most of the time, it's not a legitimate result. And there's a number of ways to correct that, or at least help. One is to require pre-registration of all experiments, and we talked about this in class, so that I, as a consumer of the science, can say, okay, how many times have similar experiments been done that didn't get anything? If it turns out there's like 1,000 of these experiments that didn't get anything, then this one that did, it's probably not the right result.
Yeah.
There's also sort of professional incentives that could be changed around where you can sort of get more, props from the academic community for doing replications that fail.
Yeah. Well, just failing in general.
Yeah, failing in general. If you could get more props for getting insignificant results, that would help.
That would help, yeah, because it's really just incentivized to get a specific number. And there are ways you can subtly craft that number or make it a little bit lower than it actually is.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
And stuff too.
Yeah, and a lot of those ways feel so right when you're doing it.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. Well, there's one of them where you're saying like, oh, well, this person doesn't fit in this data set, so we just take them out.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it seems right, but that's kind of the point.
Yeah,
is, know, if it's truly random, you need to have some stinkers in there that don't actually.
Yeah, I think in the podcast that we're sort of like talking around, it's by Barry Lamb. It's called Hackademics. He gives the example of a drug, and you get this drug, and this one guy who's not taking the drug, everybody in the population taking the drug and in the population taking the placebo, everybody is like super sick. And this one guy in the super sick group who's not taking the drug gets better the next day. well, it's natural to be like, he wasn't sick in the first place. He was misdiagnosed. Let's throw him out of the pool. But of course, if the guy in the drug pool got better the next day, you'd be like, wow, on some people, the drug works super fast.
Yeah.
And that feels so right. But a number of small decisions like that just
like stack up and create. Yeah. I remember you drawing it out and you were Xing out different things. Yeah. There was one really cool, the Bayesian formula, Bayesian formula, just kind of blew my mind, and I wanted you to kind of talk through that. And again, I have a question at the end of it, but can you kind of describe that formula and how it works, specifically in the case of getting diagnosed with like a 90% effective?
Yeah. So this I'll do what you asked in a second, but this relates very closely to something we were talking about a minute ago when I said one way we can do better is by sort of like taking common sense seriously. One thing the Bayesian formula is going to do is it's not in the example that I'll give now because the example would be kind of mathy, but I can say afterwards how it's really just taking common sense into account. It's the equivalent to that. So here's the kind of example you're asking for. You have some drug that's, say, 90% effective in treating an illness. Well, the first thing to ask yourself is, what does it mean to say the drug is 90% effective, right? What it means to say is, well, actually, let's do a testing for an illness. So a test for, because COVID is a good example. You have some test for COVID that's, say, 90% accurate. What does that mean? It means that 90% of the time, if the person has COVID, the test is going to say, yes, they have COVID. And 90% of the time, if the person doesn't have COVID, the test is going to say, no, they don't have COVID. That's what it means to say it's 90% accurate. And those things don't have to match up. Like it could be like 90% of the time if you have it, it says you have it, and 70% of the time if you don't, it says you don't. But let's just stick with 90 for both. So that's what it means to say it's 90% accurate. So then you take the test, you get diagnosed with COVID, right? You test positive. You say, okay, there's a 90% chance I have COVID. That's what you say, right? That's the natural thing to say. And what the Bayesian reasoning tells you is that's way too quick. You can't actually infer anything at all without more information. So even if the test is 90% accurate in the way we just described, when you test positive, you can infer nothing about the odds that you have COVID. So why is that? Well, here's the easiest way to see the point. Just let's make it really extreme. Suppose nobody on the planet has COVID. It's been eradicated. And we give everybody this test that's 90% accurate. You're going to get 10% false positives, right? How many of those people who test positive actually have COVID? 0%, because we just said COVID's been eradicated. So every positive test is a false positive. So if you test positive on this test, which is 90% accurate, there's a 0% chance you have COVID. Well, that's pretty bad. And it can go in the other direction too, right? Like suppose everybody on the planet has COVID. Now you test negative. What are the odds you have COVID? 100%, because everybody has it, right? Even though the test is 90% accurate. So in order to figure out whether you have COVID or not, or the odds you should assign to you having COVID, given that you tested positive, you don't just need to know the accuracy of the test. You also need to know what the starting point was. What are the odds that you have COVID? Forget whether you took the test or not. What's the frequency of COVID in the population? And if that frequency is very low, 1%, 2%, 3%, whatever, 10%, then even if the test is 90% accurate and it says you have COVID, you probably don't. And if that frequency is super high, 90% of people have it, 80% of people have it, then even if you test negative, the odds you should assign to having COVID given the negative test is still way above 50%, still very high. So knowing that sort of starting point, that frequency in the population, is absolutely crucial for assigning a probability to having COVID given a positive test or not having it given a negative test.
Yeah, well, and we did the math on it in that class, and it just blew my mind. Like I was even writing it down for people. I was like, "No, this is crazy." Like, like you just don't think about it this way. Yeah. Especially with 99% accurate stuff. Like even though that 1% can amount to really large numbers if really nobody has it. Yeah, that's right. If it's uncommon in the population, even if it's like 20% of people have it, and you have a 99% accurate test, and you test positive, you still probably don't have it. Yeah, which is, it's really difficult to wrap your head around that concept. And my question is, and I don't know if you have the answer to this, but do doctors, when they are talking about this or they are telling you the results of your test, are they very transparent about this? Do they know this? Like,
they're absolutely,
how do they talk about this?
So they're absolutely not transparent about it. And there's, I don't remember the details, but there's some experiments on this. And it turns out doctors have some sense of the fact that they should take into account the frequency in the population and not just the accuracy of the test. But they don't do the math. They're not good at weighting the frequency of the population highly enough. So they pretty much say you test positive, the test is 90% accurate, you probably have it. You test negative, it's 90% accurate, you probably don't have it. And they kind of ignore that background frequency. And that's partly sensible because in some sense, because the background frequencies are often unknown or we're really just estimating. Like in the early days of COVID, this was super pronounced, right? Like who knew what the percent in the population was?
Yeah.
But you have to say something based on a positive test or a negative test. So what you should do, and I'm not saying this is what doctors did because like I said, it seems like they're not very good at this. What you should do is you should do your best to come up with an estimate of the frequency in the population. Because without that estimate, you can infer nothing. A 99% accurate test, you test positive, you should infer nothing about the odds that you have it. It could be zero. Right?
Yeah.
So you need to make some estimate of what that background is.
And that's just that's so jarring. I think the example you used in the book was dropping a 90% down to an 8% because only 1 in like 1,000 people had it. And it's like just thinking about that, like when somebody says this test is 90% accurate, you tested positive, that means you have an 8% chance of having this. It's really difficult to like wrap your head around, and it's stuff like that that's just so crazy to me. And I can't believe doctors don't talk about it like this.
Yeah, and to the CDC's credit, they didn't initially have all this up, but they got it right and got it all on the website and said, like, look, we don't know the frequency, but we're estimating it's in this range. So here is how you should figure out the odds you have it, given you test positive.
So they ended up becoming...
So the CDC did a good job. That's different than what individual doctors do.
Well, and that's what I was thinking, like in more serious cases like cancer or, and you used an example of like, if this is true, I might have like 2 months to live. Do I start doing these things, especially if it's time sensitive? Like, I don't know how I'm supposed to react to this data if a perceived 90% is actually only an 8%, or a perceived 90% is actually like a 98%. You know what I mean? So it was very interesting.
Yeah, there's absolutely real world consequences. There's a guy named Pedro Solberg who is a beach volleyball player who was ruled out of the last Olympics for testing positive for performance-enhancing drugs. And this is against a backdrop where you don't know the frequency with which Olympians use performance-enhancing drugs, so you don't really know what to make of the test, even though it's pretty accurate. And it turns out it was wrong. They retested his sample, and it was wrong with a more fine-grained test. But he didn't get to participate because,
and stuff like that. Like, imagine being that, but bringing these statistics into the limelight is just a really cool way of challenging people's perceptions and challenging, even things that you think are so empirical. Like somebody comes up and there's no reason not to believe that when they say this is 90% effective, that it's might not actually be 90% effective. And this is not to say that I think that they're intentionally lying about it.
Not at all.
I wouldn't want to put that implication out there, but like it is definitely like, judging by the math, it is incorrect. I do have a question though, in the way that we like colloquially say 90% effective. Do you think that that's integrated? Like that's 90% after using this math formula? Like, do you think people do that when they...
So the way that, if it's done well, the way that that's done is this. You have some very reliable metric that's independent of the test for determining the presence of the characteristic you're interested in. So say it's COVID. You have some like really good test for determining if someone has COVID. And you get a population of people you know have COVID by doing this good test. And maybe the good test could be like some very careful series of blood tests where you test each person a dozen times and you also check their symptoms and you do all these things and you only take those people you just are super confident have COVID. Then you take a bunch of people you're super confident don't by doing the same thing. You test them a whole bunch of times. They have no symptoms. Now you have these two groups of people. Then what you do is you take, say, the over-the-counter kind of standard tests, and you give them to each group a bunch of times, and you see how often do you get false positives from the group that you know doesn't have it, and how often do you get false negatives from the group you know doesn't have it. And that's where you get that 90% what's the probability that you have, that you will test positive given that you have COVID, or test negative given that you don't. That's how you get those numbers in the ideal case. Now, we're not always in the ideal case.
Yeah.
We don't always have a good independent metric. Sometimes it's just like figuring out the starting point. You have to use inference to the best explanation, do some guesswork, try and figure out, how accurate should I expect this test to be given everything I know? And that's tricky business.
So you have somebody listening to this podcast with like some sort of diagnosis. How do they parse through whether this was like a accurately thought out statistic that they're getting brought up, or that this is what the box says, it's 90%?
So I think what you do is so this isn't always the case, but largely this has been my experience. Doctors are kind of going through the motions with this stuff because they don't expect the patients to really be thinking about it or to really want to hear it, want to go through this. But if you stop them and ask them, if you say like, hey, do you know the background frequency so that I can make sense of my positive test? They'll give you honest answers. So that's one thing you can do. I've done this a number of times where I've asked the doctor, like, okay, look, what's the actual frequency in the population for this characteristic at issue? Like with this with a vet actually at ISU with a dog who had been diagnosed with cancer. And to her credit, she said, I have no idea. So we need to, then how do we proceed? Well, we maybe do some further testing. We think about things in a slightly different way. And so in my experience, across a number of different cases, doctors will have sensible conversations with you about these things if you slow them down and force them to be careful. And in general, I think if you're involved in a serious interaction with the medical system, that's good advice. Get the doctor to slow down and
like talk about your things.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because the last thing I'd want to do is arm people with this notion that doctors are, stupid, when maybe sometimes they'll give out like a good statistic. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so. And I think by no means are doctors stupid. And like I said, like I sort of alluded to a second ago, I think quite often they'll just say, look, you tested positive, here's the accuracy of the test, not because they are incapable of engaging in further reflection. It's just because how many patients want them to say well, here's how you calculate the odds.
And, so that makes sense too. I'd imagine it's easier in the long run, but I just thought it was such an interesting look. Like I did the math a few times. I was like, this just seems intuitively like not what we're talking about, but then you do it, it checks out. It makes sense. So,
and I think where the sort of rubber really hits the road from the general sort of theoretical reasoning point of view is when you think of that sort of toy case as a generalization for doing science. So what I mean by that is this. Remember a minute ago I said you should always you get this experimental result, a p-value of less than 0.05 for some, people on the political extremes can't discern shades of gray as well as people in the middle. And you say, does that really fit with what I think? Does that really make sense? And that's very much like what we were just doing, because you have this accuracy of the test. That's like the p-value of less than 0.05. And then you need the frequency in the population of the characteristic. That's like your starting point. So to make that a little more explicit, you have your accuracy of your test, 90%. And then you have the unconditional probability that you have COVID. That's the probability independent of the fact that you tested positive, right? Forget that you've tested positive, just what's the frequency in the population, right? That's your starting point. Now we generalize that to think about science. We have the evidence coming in right now and how strongly each theory predicts that evidence. But let's start with, like in the shades of gray case, the hypothesis that there really is this difference predicts the difference we found in the lab more strongly than the hypothesis that there isn't really a difference. But then we have our starting point that says, really? Your perceptual system is affected by your political affiliation? That doesn't seem right. And that's kind of like the frequency in the population. That's your starting point. So if you always are constraining your incoming evidence and how strongly each theory predicts that evidence by common sense, you'll sort of do much better.
Okay. Well, because that was going to be my next question is how do you have that starting point when there's not numbers? I can't give you a percentage of people that see gray in different ways. So, but that is a good point.
That question is a really hard question. And it's not just a hard question. I mean, there's Bayesian statisticians who do things in just this way. And when you ask them how they come up with those numbers, they sometimes will give you sort of like straightforward observational ways to come up with those numbers, but quite often it's like there's all sorts of guesswork. And it looks to me like the way I would describe it is it's inference to the best explanation. It's like I have to come up with some quantity here. I have to assign some probability. How probable is this theory to start with? I have to come up with a number, otherwise I can't proceed. And it could even be something like COVID. So we're in like, say, May of 2020. Nobody knows the prevalence of COVID in the population, but they have to have some estimate so they know what to tell you, given that you test positive. And you just do things like this, like, I don't know anybody who has symptoms, but like I heard this guy does, or like it seems like hospital rates are up in this hospital, and you just kind of like use all the evidence you have to make your best guess. And I think that's quite often how it works in real life.
Yeah, well, and kind of like we were saying earlier, I don't know if it's possible to prescribe that everybody bust out their pen and paper between every decision that they make. And so it is this weird line to draw, like, when do I really start thinking critically versus when do I kind of like use my efficiency to my advantage to get something done? And so I'd imagine with people who are doing research, especially when they do it professionally, they might teeter that line a little bit harder than they should.
That could be right. I'll say this. I think the key thing for most of us and in day-to-day life, the key insight that you get out of Bayesian reasoning is to not forget your starting point. It's just all too easy to be like, here's the evidence coming in, here's the theory that fits best with that evidence, so that's what I think. And the key insight is, no, you need to consider the starting point. So like, I mean, here's an obvious case in point where I think most people get it right. Watching a magician, and the magician makes something disappear or makes something appear out of thin air. Well, if I just focus on that evidence, what theory best predicts that evidence? Well, it's like physics is very different than I thought it was, right? There's magic in the world. But if I take account of my starting point that says like, one, things like that don't happen, right? The frequency with which things appear out of thin air or disappear is close to zero, right, in my past experience. And two, like this guy's a magician. He's designed to trick me. Then given that starting point, even if the theory that predicts the evidence best says that physics is wrong and there's magic, I'll still end up concluding the probability that physics is wrong and there's magic, given this evidence, is really low, because my starting point says close to zero for that hypothesis.
Well, and this kind of gets into maybe what I was alluding to earlier. It seems like when you're starting from what you understand at the beginning, or maybe what you're looking for. It seems really easy to kind of get lost in the sauce of like, especially if you start biased, or if you're doing something that might have an answer that you want. It seems like you could start biased if you started from this position of what do I know? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know a ton, so maybe I didn't educate myself enough before I started from this point, or maybe I'm not including some of the biases that I had when I started at this point. And so it does seem, I'm kind of skeptical of trusting myself in that way sometimes. Although compared to new evidence, it's probably better to just go off my starting point, but I don't think either is very great.
No, I mean, you're right that this is super tricky. So this is sometimes called, the starting point is called the prior probability you assign to the hypothesis. It's prior because it's prior to the evidence you're looking at right now. It's called the problem of bad priors. So I have these really bad prior probabilities that I'm assigning to hypotheses. And now I look at some evidence and how strongly it predicts the theory. But when I take account of those bad priors, I end up in the wrong place. Right? Like my starting point was bad. So maybe my starting point is like, hey, the world's miraculous and things do vanish all the time into nowhere and appear from nowhere. And now I watch The Magician and I'm like, certainly now there's magic, right? This is a serious problem. It's also a serious problem because, I mean, you put it in terms of biases. You can think of those starting points as your biases. And you and I have different biases. We look at the same exact evidence. We had different starting points, different biases. We draw different conclusions after assessing the same exact evidence. And we can even say, here's how strongly this theory predicts the evidence. We can agree on that. Here's how strongly this theory predicts the evidence. We agree on that. But our starting points were so different that we end up accepting different theories. And an example I like here is climate change. So we can both agree that the hypothesis that fossil fuel emissions cause warming of the atmosphere, increased energy in the atmosphere, but the probability that you'd get increased energy in the atmosphere, given the hypothesis that fossil fuel emissions cause that, is pretty high. And yet we can disagree about whether the probability that fossil fuel emissions are causing this increased energy is high, because you started out thinking, well, like, there's no way that that's happening. Like, and I started out thinking that's probably happening, or neutral, or whatever.
Well, yeah, and that's super interesting too in the realm of politics. I feel like having this understanding of how research really is, I feel like just could make you just a weapon in the field of politics, of actually like understanding the studies that people are citing, because I feel as if people aren't very familiar with like the literature that decides some of these decisions.
Yeah.
And even in like the few examples that I've brought up, you've given out like a vocabulary definition of like this issue or like this thing that's been talked about. And I just think that's like it's something that I think more people should know about the things that influence their life.
Yeah, that would be nice. And the weapon idea is very clearly true, and it's unfortunate that it works in the direction it works. So there's a book, it was made into a movie, I don't know if you're familiar with, called Merchants of Doubt. Naomi Oreskes, who's a historian of science, and Erica Conway wrote this book. And basically what they do is they say there's all these scientists who they focus on climate change and the claim that smoking causes cancer, the claim that carbon emissions cause climate change, and the claim that smoking causes cancer. And they note that there are all these uncertainties in scientific reasoning, but the general population doesn't recognize that there's all these uncertainties. So people who are skilled at noting the uncertainties can persuade the general population to reject what is good science, since the general population has the view, well, if there are all of these uncertainties, then it must not be good science, or something like that. So these skillful people can sort of weaponize this and be like, here's all these uncertainties, and they're correct. There are all of these uncertainties, but the inference that they want people to draw, which is that therefore we should conclude that smoking doesn't cause cancer or whatever, that's not a good inference. But they sort of leave out that part, right? They're just like, here's all these uncertainties. Now you decide what you think.
I don't know. It's scary, and this is kind of the realm I fall into sometimes of not knowing these things, or like making these decisions. Maybe this is more what I was talking about in terms of like perception in a moral way, of you make these decisions based on things that you think you know, but you don't actually really know them, and you haven't done enough research into knowing it. And I guess I wonder, as somebody who's studied these things for a while, like, what advice do you have for navigating this realm of knowing things, like this realm of like, which I guess is your whole study in epistemology, but like for the layman person, like, what do you recommend for these people that are trying to navigate this? Yeah,
so there's a few things. One, there's some general intellectual virtues like open-mindedness, which we talked about at the beginning, which are incredibly important. Once you're certain that a hypothesis is true, or certain that a hypothesis is false, you're basically done. Because if you're certain that it's true, you're going to be more confident that it's true than you are more confident in that hypothesis than you are in any evidence that might go the other direction. So you're in a good position to just ignore all that evidence. And that's a very dangerous position to be in. So one thing is, be open-minded. Just always allow that, like, I might be pretty confident this is true. I might even say I know it's true, but I'm open to changing my mind if new evidence comes in. And that's a sort of general intellectual virtue. Another general intellectual virtue is sincerity. So don't be trying to win. Too often I think we're trying to win. Be trying to get it right. So, I think some proposition P is true. You come in and give me some evidence that Q is true and P is false, or so let's say that P is false. I can always like maneuver and be like, look, I'm pretty clever. So even here's your evidence, but here's some other evidence. And don't do that. Be like, okay, you've given me evidence that P is false. Let me take that really seriously and see how that weighs against the evidence that I have that P is true. So be sincere, like really be trying to get at what's true. So open-mindedness and sincerity, I think, will get you pretty far. then you need the sort of skills to actually, assess the evidence in a careful and sincere way. And that, I think, is just hard work. I don't think there's any simple advice or simple tricks. Like, in the class that you took, we did some deductive logic. I think deductive logic is a super useful way for modeling ordinary reasoning. But it's not like, you took the class, but even at the end of the class, it's probably still pretty hard for you to take a paragraph and put the argument in deductive form.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't, and that's not anything to do with you. You were very good in the class. It's hard. It's something you do, or it's a way of thinking that you cultivate throughout your life, and you can be better or worse at it. But just like try and do that sometimes. Learning how Bayesian reasoning works, so you stop making these mistakes. Learning about cognitive biases, so you learn, okay, here's a way that my brain is going to be pushing me around. Learning little tricks, like take account of the starting point in general, not just when solving some math equation involving Bayes' formula. There's a lot of sort of particular skills that you can work on, but that's more like, I don't know, like I'm trying to think of an analogy here, but like, you could think of those as like if you want to be, the sort of virtues that I started out with, the open-mindedness and sincerity, that's kind of like advice equivalent to like, if you want to be good at shooting baskets, like go shoot or something. It's like general how to get into the realm where you can do well. But then like learn Bayes' theorem and how to apply it, learn to take account of your starting points and practice that skill, cultivate that skill. That's more like correcting your elbow position when you're shooting and like thinking about it on every rep. And
Right. Well, and I think it's really incredible that you started with those two principles of like being honest about it, being like sincere about the things that you're talking about, and being open-minded. I think obviously it's really difficult to just stop being closed-minded. You know what I mean? Like most people think that they're open-minded, and that's part of the issue, And so, but it's one of those things where like really the only thing we can do is hold people accountable when they're not being open-minded, and to constantly say, be open-minded, because it just takes that one moment of like weakness where like open-mindedness can come in and be like, let's get out of here and like change what you think. And so, I think it's probably some of the best stuff you could preach in regards to not being as susceptible to some of these really scary perception things.
So here's something that never works, but I think I wish would work. When people are being closed-minded, challenge them to identify some evidence that would get them to change their mind.
Yes, and I've heard this before.
Have you? Okay.
No, it's really good to continue.
Yeah, I think that's like I said, it doesn't work. But like,
I think it does. I think it plants a seed. I think another big problem with people who are arguing and people who are trying to change their mind is their perception is that this one conversation is going to be it. Yes, like I'm going to have some Tom Hanks movie speech that like convinces you to change your ways and become a better person. But it doesn't work like that. Yeah. In fact, I'm probably going to be years away from this conversation. Going to be years away from actually changing your mind. You just need to hear this enough to where you're like, okay, fine, like whatever. You know what I mean? And so I think people have this perception that what I'm going to say is just going to change everything about who you are. But it's like, no, I'm really just this. You're just going to step on me for a little while, and then one day you're going to be like, holy crap, what that guy said 2 years ago actually makes sense now because I heard this new thing.
No, I think that's exactly right. I can give an example like this from my own history. I was never like anti-feminist or anything like that, but I wouldn't have thought of myself as especially feminist. And in college, my wife's roommate was sort of like putting forward some kind of standard feminist theses, and it's very dismissive, not in a rude way, but just like not taking them very seriously. But over years, I thought about it, and I'm like, oh, she's right. She wouldn't have walked away from that conversation, or maybe never thought she had any effect, but she did.
Well, you think about it, and you think about like the starting points where you're like, I did watch this one thing that kind of changed the way that I think about it, and so much of it is chance as well.
Yes.
And that's crazy. It's like you need to be in the perfect mindset, perfect moment. Someone needs to say it in the most perfect way.
Yeah.
That just like really gets you to be like, dang, dang. Like I had some really strong political beliefs not really strong. I was always kind of skeptical. And I was pretty certain about it. And then I just watched this. I had never seen it flipped around where the incoherent person was the person who agrees with me.
Yeah.
And then I saw them just get owned by somebody. I was like, oh my God. Yeah. I was like, wow, you just don't see it.
Yep.
You never see, sometimes you just don't get to see your thoughts challenged effectively. You just don't get to see it very often.
Yeah.
And I think it's a combination of all those things that culminate to actually changing it. But I think consistently saying these are the virtues that you need to have, I think that's like just a really good start to get people to really think about these things, and it excites me. Well, I mean, like, what else can you do? I think it's noble at the very least to say something like that.
What else can you do is certainly right.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much else other than beating people up, I guess. Yeah. There were two relatively small things that I wanted to talk about before we wrap this up, but they were both things that you said in your questionnaire that I was interested in. The first of which was questions I would ask you about pride, or what were your proudest things, and you said that you're not sure that you understand that. Like, I guess, what are your like instant reactions when I say?
So there's some, I don't know what to call them, mental attitudes that people talk about, and jealousy is one of them, and pride is one of them. And I know the descriptions people give, but I just don't think I feel them. Not that they're bad things to feel, I just don't think I have them. So like, I take it jealousy is wanting something because someone else has it. Sometimes like I'll want something that I see someone else has and be like, oh yeah, I'd want that too. But it's never like the fact that they have it makes me want it. It just doesn't happen to me, but other people describe it as happening to them. So I take it to be a real thing. And pride is kind of like that. Like, there's lots of things that I like doing, and there's lots of things that I'm happy that I did. But I take it that's not what pride is. Pride is supposed to be something else. It's like the fact that I did it is somehow deeply meaningful in a way, more than just like, I'm glad that I did that.
Interesting.
And
I wonder if that's a perspective that other people take and how that influences how you view things and your motivations for doing things. I mean, how do you think, I don't know how much of the reasoning why I do things is because of pride or because of future pride. I don't know how pride affects me generally, I guess, but I'd imagine you not having pride affects you in ways that you might be aware of too. Have you noticed that?
I suspect so, because things like formally acknowledged accomplishments, whether in whatever domain, professional or whatever else, I suspect that if I had that thing that you're calling pride, I would pursue that a lot more. And I don't really, I'm pretty indifferent to that sort of thing.
That's pretty interesting. And a lot of the times it's kind of a noble thing ironically, it's a prideful thing to not have pride and for some people. But it seems as if you're communicating that's just something that you don't necessarily have to suppress. It's just something that like just isn't there.
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. So like, I'm not a thoroughgoing Aristotelian or anything, but Aristotle talks about the golden mean, where you have all these different sort of virtues balanced just the right way. I suspect that ideal balance would have pride higher than 0.
Than like what you might describe yourself.
Yeah. So I suspect that it's not, my point on that spectrum is not the ideal point, but it's just.
I'd imagine instinctively it seems as if you might be motivated slightly less as a whole, but you might be motivated more authentically towards you. So it'd be like quantity over quantity by lacking that pride. I feel like pride motivates a lot of people to be more productive or maybe do more things, but the actual motivation is kind of, I don't know, vacuous. It doesn't really mean a lot because there's pride involved. So I imagine you have an interesting...
Maybe. I see what you're saying. I'm not sure that being motivated by the kind of extrinsic factors is in any way defective. So I'm not sure about that part.
Yeah. Well, I just thought that was very interesting. And there's another thing that you said about leading and being led, that like you kind of have this aversion. You said like, I don't really want to lead or like be led. What is your initial reaction to that?
Yeah, I don't, it's true. I do not want to lead or be led. There's this kind of anarchist spirit that I've always been very sympathetic to. I mean, I've sort of like thought about political anarchism in the older sense, not the contemporary libertarian sense, in the older sort of socialist libertarian sense. And I don't know what exactly I think about all that. But there's a spirit. Chomsky talks about this when he says he's an anarchist. He talks about this spirit of like just valuing freedom. And I am very sympathetic to that spirit. I don't really want to be told what to do, but I also don't want to be telling anybody what to do. And I know that there's leadership that doesn't involve being, telling people what to do or being told what to do. But I guess one way to think about it is this. I want to choose my own ends, and I want to make an informed decision about how to get to those ends. But I don't want someone to be sort of like, navigate, choosing my ends or help or sort of prescribing my path to get to those ends for me.
Okay.
And I don't want to do that for anybody else either.
Okay. Do you find, I think instinctively when I think about like teaching, it kind of seems as if you might be doing that, but maybe not to the direct extent that you dislike. Yeah, well, I mean, in the classroom to a large extent, because of the way our classrooms are structured, I am doing it in a way I dislike. So it's probably good. That's how I could. When I was in college, for a psych class, I volunteered at a shelter for women who were abused in various ways. And the function that I served was I played with their kids so they could have some free time. And it was like complete chaos whenever I was there. I'd come in and these other people would be working with the kids and it would all look nice and calm. And then it like very quickly descended into complete chaos. And then someone else would come in and there'd be order again. And it's basically like, I don't like telling people what to do. If the kid wants to be like, I don't want them to hurt each other, but if they want to be like screaming and whatever, then whatever. And similarly, the parkour class I teach, it's like sometimes the kids will say, this is great. It's just like hanging out. And that's because like I set up the situation so they can learn the things they want to learn. And like I'll walk around and give advice, but they pretty much can like explore things the way they want to explore them. And that's reflective of this general sort of anarchist impulse, you might call it, where people choose their ends and figure out how they want to achieve them. And ideally, as a teacher, I would just be sort of like there to help them achieve them in the way they wanted me to help them achieve them. But you're absolutely right. A standard classroom doesn't allow that. And you have to sort of be telling people what to do. And for perfectly sensible reasons, if I made every exam optional and let you do the assignments you want to do, as a rational agent, what you do is be like, I have all these competing demands on my time. My other teachers aren't giving me that same opportunity. So for this class, I'm going to do nothing. Yep.
And, yeah.
Yeah, and I can see that. That's very interesting. I don't think I necessarily agree with you. I think there's something maybe to be said about helping people. Like if you see somebody that's you think is doing it wrong, like really bad, there's an urge to kind of be like, don't do that. You know what I mean? And I wonder how much that influences your decision on what you prescribe to people, what conclusions you come to.
So you're right. There's an urge to say, don't do that. That's for sure. And I guess you could think of that as an urge to lead. I guess I never thought of it that way. Maybe it is. This comes up. I coach volleyball for my daughter's team. I'm an assistant coach. And it comes up a lot watching the kids. I'm like, like your shape is wrong here. You shouldn't be like, it'd be so easy to be constantly correcting. And there is you're right that like there's something good about correcting, but it seems like the evidence is, I haven't looked into this carefully, but sort of people I trust who work on coaching have told me that the evidence is that you want to give at least like 3 non-corrective compliments for every correction. And you don't want to come up with arbitrary non-corrective compliments. They have to be legitimate. And one of the main functions that serves is it gets you to shut up because it's hard to find those 3. And it turns out that that's like better for the kids by and large, is for you to be quiet and let them get the natural feedback that they get from like the ball didn't go where they wanted it to go. And you can tell them their shape was wrong or they should hold their platform this way or whatever. But it's a much more effective feedback that the ball didn't go where they wanted it to go. And
that's
I think in general that's true.
That's very interesting. I'll chew on that. Like I said, I don't think I necessarily disagree with this, but my instinct would be that some people are really awesome and should be a figure worth following in that kind of way. And so for me, I look at it more as a wasted talent. If like, I think you're very competent in the way that you think about a lot of things. And so, I mean, obviously I have you on the podcast to put the spotlight on you and to show you to other people. So theoretically I'd want you to lead, you know what I mean? And it would, I'd want that for you and for the people around you. But at the same time, there's also obviously forms of leadership that are really awful, where we allow people to lead that shouldn't be led, or we get led by people that we should not be following. Yeah. So I understand it.
And this may be a sort of superficial semantic disagreement that we might have, which is I'm thinking of, we might just be thinking of leadership in different ways.
And yeah. So and that's probably more likely what it is. But I also thought that was interesting, and that sparked an interesting thought in my head. But the studio is closing actually soon, cool. So I wanted to give you an opportunity just to kind of round this out, and if there are any general overarching messages about maybe the things that we've talked about that you want to leave the people who have watched thus far with, I really encourage you to maybe say something general about perceiving your life or something along those lines. I kind of like to give you the final floor to say something that you think the viewers should walk home with.
I don't have anything special to add. I think you've done a good job of eliciting the useful things that I might have to say, and they're not that exciting. So I'll repeat a couple of things that I've already said. Be open-minded. Correspondingly, don't assign a probability of 100% to anything you think. Always keep it lower so that new evidence can change your mind. Be serious, sincere. Don't think of, any discussion you're having, but especially political disputes or moral disputes, as attempts to win, or think of them as attempts to figure out what the best or most correct or whatever it is course of action is or way of thinking is. And I would advise for the sort of like being able to then figure out what's true once you have those dispositions in place, do some philosophy, take some philosophy classes, and do some science, take some science classes so that you can learn how to figure out what's true and what's false.
Well, it was awesome having you on. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks.